Welcome back, dear learners. We will continue the topic long term sources of finance, part second. Long term sources of finance. Long term sources of finance provide funds for a longer duration. Usually, the period exceeds 5 to 7 years. These sources are mainly used for purchasing fixed assets. They are all also used for expansion and diversification. Long term finance involves large amount of money. It also involves long term commitment. Decisions regarding long term finance are strategic in nature. Wrong decisions may affect the company for many years. Therefore, management must be very careful by selecting long term sources of finance. So, we will discuss one by one related to the long term sources of finance. The first one is the equity shares. The first long term source of finance is the equity shares, generally called as in the ownership capital. Equity shares represent ownership in a company. Equity shareholders are the real owners of the business. When a person buys equity shares, he or she becomes a part of that company called as in the part owners. He shares both profits and risk of the company. Equity shareholders receive dividend only if the company earns profit. There is no fixed rate of dividend on equity shares. Dividend may increase or decrease every year. Equity shareholders enjoy voting rights. They have the right to participate in important decisions. They elect the board of directors for the company. Equity shares are irredeemable in nature. Always it is the equity shares only. This means capital is returned only at the time of liquidation. For example, when you buy shares of any company like Tata Consultancy Service, Infosys, Wipro, or any company shares, you become an owner of that company. The equity shareholders played the major role, and the equity share amount, what we call as in the ownership capital, is for the longer duration. It helps for the artificial person for the longer period. So we will understand What are the advantages and disadvantages of equity shares? Now we will discuss on advantages and disadvantages of equity shares. From the point of view of the company, what are the advantages for the company and what are the disadvantages for the company when they issue equity shares to the common people or the public for the long term sources of finance? Equity shares provide permanent capital to the company. The company is not required to repay equity capital. There is no fixed obligation to pay dividend. Dividend is paid only when profit are earned. No security is required for issuing equity shares. This increases the financial flexibility in the organization. Equity capital increases the borrowing capacity of the company. It reduces the risk of financial insolvency. In the same way, certain disadvantages also there. However, equity shares are a costly sources of finance. They dilute control of existing shareholders. They may increase agency cost. There is also risk of hostile takeover. Advantages and disadvantages of equity shares. From the point of view of shareholders, equity shareholders enjoy voting rights. They can influence management decisions. They may receive high dividend during the good years. They may also receive bonus shares. Equity shares provide capital appreciation. Share prices may increase in the market. Equity shares are highly liquid. They can be easily bought and sold in the market. However, income from equity share is uncertain. Risk is high. There is no security of the capital. Shareholders have no control over dividend rates. Now we will discuss on preferred shares. Shares that have preference over equity regarding dividends and repayments. Preference shares have preference over equity shares. Preference is given in payment of dividend. Preference is also given for the preferential shareholders in repayment of capital. The rate of dividend on preference shares is fixed. In nature, dividend is paid before the equity shareholders. Generally, preference shareholders do not have voting rights. Preference shareholders do not participate in management. Preference shareholders combine features of equity and debentures. Thus, benefit for preferential shareholders. They are less risky than equity shares. Types of preference shares. The first category of preference share is cumulative preference shares. Cumulative preference shares accumulate unpaid dividends. If dividend is not paid in 1 year or in last year, it is carried forward. That type of the nature preference shares called as in the cumulative preference shares. Non-cumulative preference shares do not accumulate dividend. Unpaid dividend is lost. Participating preference shares share extra profit. Non-participating preference shares do not share extra profit. Convertible preference shares can be converted into equity shares after this specific period. Non-cumulative, non-convertible preference shares cannot be converted into equity shares. But shares are maintained only as the preference shares. Redeemable preference shares are repaid after a fixed period. Irredeemable preference shares are repaid only at liquidation. The merits and demerits of preference shares or preferential capital from the point of view of the company. Preferential capital is useful for companies that want funds without diluting control. The dividend on preference share is fixed. So when the dividend is fixed, the company can plan its financial for upcoming period is very easily. The next merit is there is no risk of loss of control because of preference shareholders usually do not have voting rights. That's why the agency problem will be minimizes. No security is required for issuing preference shares. This increases flexibility for the company. Preference shares do not create risk of financial insolvency like debentures. They are generally cheaper than equity shares in terms of control cost. In the same way, Preference share capital has certain demerits. However, preference share capital is not permanent in nature. It has to be redeemed after a fixed period. It means that they're redeemed by the company after a specific duration. The cost of preference capital is higher than the debt. The reason is it is the preference in nature and fixed dividend is there. That's why it is cost of preference capital is higher than the cost of debt. The preference shares may not attract many investors. That is also the demerit of the preference share capital. Same way, merits and demerits of preference share capital from the point of view of shareholders. The major merits are preference shareholders enjoy preferential right to dividend. First, they receive the dividend compared with the equity shareholders. They also enjoy preferential right to repayment of capital. This reduces their risk compared to equity shareholders. In case of cumulative preference shares, unpaid dividend accumulates. This protects preferential shareholders' interest. And the same way, certain demerits also there. Preferential shareholders generally do not have voting right. They cannot participate in management decisions. They do not enjoy capital appreciation like equity shareholders. The dividend rate does not increase, it is constant in nature. These are the major demerits of preferential share capital from the point of view of shareholders. Thank you all for daily updates. Follow Curious Commerce Financial Management Hub in WhatsApp channel. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe to your friends. The topic, the long-term source of finance, will be continued in part third.